started today, I want to invite you on your webinar portal. There is a Q&A button. There's also a chat button that you can see as well. But I will be taking questions and answers on that Q&A feature. The chat feature, you can visit with one another if you'd like to. I won't be able to monitor that. But if you would like to, please use that Q&A. And I'll try to get to those questions when I'm able to. Especially, I'll reserve some time toward the end of our session today to answer some of those questions for you. When it comes to myself and really my experience as well as interest in this topic, my experience really started as being a very young leader. I moved into youth ministry right out of my time at Ozark Christian College, and within the first year, was asked to step into a senior leadership role at a church in Illinois. At that point in time, I was 24, 25 years old and was leading a staff of individuals whom I have become very good friends with over the years. But the reality is all of them were older than me. And so trial by fire led me to figure out how to lead not only a staff that was older, but also a staff as a younger leader in an effective way. So my hope is today is that this topic is one that is relevant to where you are and to your staff dynamic. I am going to focus predominantly on the church as an environment, but from time to time you'll hear me refer to organizations or institutions, recognizing that many of the principles we talk about are able to cross over between churches to organizations and to various institutions. So again, thank you as we talk about this. The establishing a healthy church culture or a staff culture recognizes that not all of you are responsible for paid staff. And so I also want to give kind of a nod or some attention to those of you who lead volunteers. I think some of these principles will be applicable to that as well. So again, I am thankful that you are here, and we will begin. I will be able to send you this presentation, this PowerPoint presentation, if you are interested in any of this information later on. Just email me at my Ozark email address, dalrymple.jim@occ.edu. Well, as we begin, one of the things that we recognize about this dynamic is that we need to clarify, what do we mean by healthy? As a young leader, some of the ways that I would have defined healthy and healthy staff culture would have been an absence of conflict or criticism, perhaps the fact that we never experienced failure or frustration with one another. And over the years, I've wrestled with kind of this paradigm of having a church that I serve in or an organization that I serve in, and the one that I see out in the future as a possibility or a dream of some kind. And at times that structure of or that tension between the two, the present reality and the future wish or dream, can lead to some disillusionment. And so I want to start by asking this question: what do you mean when we say staff culture, and even when we mean healthy staff culture? My hunch is this, is that if you are joining, you're either a new leader leading a new group of people, or you're someone who perhaps has been frustrated by some of the dynamics in your current staff and current situation. So I am glad that you're here, but to me, when it comes to clarifying what we mean by healthy, I really mean what you see on that right-hand column. Commonality is something we want with those whom we work. We want to share something, whether that's a mission or a vision, a calling of some kind. We want to have some commonality. And of course, those of us in the church, we have in Christ and in our sense of calling, our sense of mission, we have a great sense of commonality, or at least we should. We want camaraderie. We want people to have our backs, and we want to get the backs of other people. We want to be able to laugh and cry together and hurt together. And we want those experiences to draw us closer together. We do want clarity. We want to know what it is we are being asked to do and how we are being asked to do it, what will get us in trouble, and what will lead us to a definition of faithfulness or success. We want clarity of a job description and responsibilities. And so we also want concern. We want people to be concerned about who we are and what our dreams are, what our sense of calling is, when we're hurting, or when we're feeling the need for other people to notice what we have done. And so by this definition, or by this clarity, I want to come to a moment where we define healthy, not as perfect or having, everything figured out, but as a sense of a group of people who share so many things in common that they're in a healthy way able to even have conflict and have criticism and have frustration with each other, and yet move forward together in a common and unified way. Horst Schultz said this. He was a leader of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and honestly, someone who I've studied who has instilled value in the culture in his organizations. He's someone who writes a book entitled Excellence Wins. He says leadership is creating an environment in which people want to be a part of the organization and not just work for the organization. You've perhaps had those moments where you've driven to work and seen a vehicle, maybe a staff member, maybe a volunteer or another key leader, and thought, man, I just don't want to go in there. Or maybe the culture in which you work is so toxic that it leads even to anxiety or fear as you get ready to go. Or as you leave, there's a breath of fresh air that says, oh, glad to get out of there. No, what we're challenging you to do is to shape that culture, to establish that culture in such a way that people are excited, that people anticipate, and that people are encouraged by the people that surround them, by their staff and the people they work with each day. Again, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it does mean that it is healthy. So perhaps you've seen, if not, I would encourage you to read or to listen to Patrick Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of Team. In that book, he lists 5 what he would consider common dysfunctions that lead to an eroding staff culture. And as you look at these 5 principles, perhaps what you should do is sit down and ask, which of these are true in my context today? The first one is this: an inattention to results. In fact, in the paradigm he defines, this inattention to results is more an inattention to collective results. Instead, what you have is each staff person goes off rogue and does their own thing. They have their ministry silo, their program silos, and they keep track of their own things according to their own priorities. But when it comes to a collective whole, the team really doesn't have what another author would consider a compelling scorecard. What are we doing together that is advancing our mission in one direction? So an inattention to results. The second category would be an avoidance of accountability. I've worked with churches, consulted with churches, talked to individual staff who know that the culture is toxic, but no one will confront anyone about it. In fact, from the eldership on down through the senior leaders, everyone seems to kind of brush the problems under the rug, and there is just this avoidance of accountability. Most often it gets so toxic that I've seen some churches that no longer have staff meetings. The staff come and they go to their offices, they do their job, but they really don't ever get together and talk things out or work things out. There's this avoidance of not only one another, but also this avoidance of accountability for actions. Number 3, he mentions a lack of commitment. In this sense, there is no camaraderie, and so people lack the commitment to each other and to the organization as a whole. There's no clarity of buy-in of here's what we're doing together and here's where we're going together, so a lack of commitment. And so they make decisions as a whole, but no one really has the buy-in to make those things take place over the long run. Number 4 is a fear of conflict. And again, based upon various personalities, some of you will struggle with this in your own personality as a leader. But in this kind of an environment, this kind of a staff culture, there is this kind of what Patrick Lencioni calls an artificial harmony. Everyone on the surface seems to get along. But the reality is no one's really going to speak up when they disagree. And there's this passive aggressiveness that can come along with that. We as Christians can be really good at this, to be quite honest, and we can be passive aggressive, and we can even find ourselves being nice, but ultimately everything else in the culture erodes because of this artificial harmony that we have, and this fear of conflict, this fear of pushing things forward, even when they should move forward according to our mission and our calling. The last one that Patrick mentions is an absence of trust. And this is where everything has eroded down to the core, to where individual staff members no longer trust their feedback, no longer trust their decisions, and there is this sense, I would even say, of paranoia amongst the staff and one another. You may be experiencing one or more of these at this point in time. In fact, what I'd encourage you to do is, as we answer and do the Q&A time, is feel free to even just post, here's something that our staff is struggling with out of these 5. I don't want to just focus on what Patrick Lencioni mentions, but I do want to say this on the reverse of that. He encourages staff to take these in reverse order and work on health. So go to trust as a leader and instill trust in those who are following you by being vulnerable and telling them when you have failed and telling them when you are weak and asking them to come alongside and follow you again. So being vulnerable. He talks about entering into and practicing or even rehearsing conflict, setting new commitments together collectively and having these shared commitments with one another, practicing a cadence of accountability and working that into even your schedule and into your practice as a church staff. And the last one would be is then come up with that compelling scorecard that you as a staff will continue to work toward. What I've discovered in this process is that various churches talk about staff culture, but when they talk about it, most of the culture is actually accidental. In fact, I want to give you 3 labels when it comes to staff culture and ask you to identify with one of them. Many staffs come and they talk about the problems, the dysfunctions of their team. But when they're asked, so what have you done to address those things? What have you done to change the cadence of your time together? And what have you done to focus that team? Most of it is really done by accident. There was a book I read a number of years ago called The Power of Habit. In this, Charles Duhigg says that 40% of the actions that people make and decisions that people make every day are actually habits. They're not decisions. In fact, Microsoft had a commercial a few years ago that said 35,000 decisions are made every day by an individual on average. So if that's true, if that research, which it's kind of shaky, that research, but if Microsoft is right and you make 35,000 decisions every day, but 40% of those decisions are habits, that is not only true for you, that is also true for your staff, and then collectively as a system, that is true for your church. My hunch is this: many of the things that make up your culture are habits that you have instilled that are accidental. They were either there when you started, or they have become the new normal and no one has changed them because it's just predictable and that's the way that you go through the week. An example of this: the average person drives the same way on their way to work or school every single time that they drive. It's part of why it helps the brain process life and make things a little bit easier. We don't have as much decision fatigue because of that. Well, my hunch is as you drive through the week, pretty much the same way every week. And so if you are not instilling some change to that culture, I would argue, man, many of the things that are true, whether they're toxic or healthy, are accidental in the course of time. We'll move beyond that, and we find that you can have a staff culture that is aspirational. And I also find many churches and organizations where this is true for them. They say about their staff, hey, we want to be a staff that is, let's use the value honest. We want to be a staff that is honest. We want to be real with one another. We want to be vulnerable. We want to confront problems, but we want to do so in love. And they have these aspirational values, this aspirational culture that they know is out there. But the reality is they've not done the work, and they've not gone through the behavioral changes and the steps to make it move beyond this aspiration that they have. We can do this in our personal life. We can say, hey, as a family, we value health. And yet every night, we're drinking soda and we're eating fast food and pizza. No, we aspire to be healthy, but that's not truly changing the culture of our family. So I want to encourage you in this webinar to move beyond accidental and aspirational into what I'm going to call actualized staff culture or actualized values. This is where you begin to see that those things that you've put in place are very intentional and they are becoming reality. You can trace them to habits and behaviors and decisions that take place every day. In fact, you can see them so much that they become a part of the landscape, the language, and they become part of the everyday rhythm of your church culture and church dynamic. So we want to clarify, so how are we intentionally, use that word, how are we intentionally shaping the culture that we are in? And I want to suggest to you that, kind of to simplify, these 3 steps become some things that we can do to be more intentional about shaping or establishing a healthy culture, to move beyond accidental and aspirational into the phase of actualized healthy staff culture. The first word here, embody, is one we want to focus on first. The reality is we follow a leader who embodied not just the culture. I don't want to anachronistically impose on the New Testament, current leadership jargon, but we know this about Jesus. He wanted us to follow him and to be like him. In fact, Paul says, be like me, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And so we are a part of I'm going to call it an organization, but it's a church. We are part of the church that embodies the values and the culture of our leader, or at least that's what we aspire to. So we see this as Paul even writes to the Ephesians. Paul writes in Ephesus, as a prisoner of the Lord, walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. And then he says, with humility, gentleness, patience, I love this phrase, bearing with each other in love. And I'm going to suggest to you that you will spend more time in a church staff often with them than you will your own family. And sometimes you will need to bear with them in love. It's that long-suffering patience that we have that looks to others as more important than ourselves, Philippians chapter 2. And we say we are, according to Paul, eager then to maintain this unity of the Spirit with the bond of peace, or in the bond of peace. What do you see here? Well, the church is called by Paul to take these values, these life, giving principles that Jesus lived out, and we are called to live those out ourselves. And perhaps for you, one of the things that would be helpful is to just walk through the New Testament and ask, okay, so what are the core values, the core behaviors of the early church, of Jesus? And what are we saying we aspire to, but what are we actually living out? And begin to rehearse those things and practice those things and teach those things, study those things as a staff. Later on in Ephesians, we see a similar kind of thing, where we discover that those who are leaders in the church are called to equip everyone else in ministry and lead them toward maturity. And we see that there's values, there's mission, there's purpose, there's direction, and all of these things. And we evaluate ourselves based upon what Christ has done and what Christ has called us to. Again, to the church that's in Ephesus, this time writing to Timothy, Paul says, hey, I'm writing this letter so that if I'm delayed, everyone might know how they ought to behave in the church, which is the church of the living God, this pillar and buttress of truth. So even for Paul in his letters, he writes to churches to help them grow toward Christ's likeness, to help them become more healthy. And one of the ways that he promotes this is through communication of, here's what it looks like to live and act and walk more like Jesus. It might be helpful for us to ask the question, how are we going to embody Christ's likeness as a staff to one another, to the church, and to the world around us? And begin to enter into that kind of a study that begins to spell these things out. Now, again, for Timothy, Paul says, I want those who are in leadership, whether they're elders, overseers, or deacons, Latin term for that is ministers, I want them to be above reproach. I want them to be mature so that other people look at them and say, they are who they say they are. They are followers of Jesus. And so some of the value statements there are that they're faithful to their family, that they have self-control, that they treat others with gentleness and respect, with hospitality, that they don't love money, they love people, and that they're not puffed up with conceit. And I say this not just to, in kind of a cliche way, show that we have this principle in Scripture that is in play, but I want this to be gospel-centered. I want the gospel to be what we come around as a staff and embody the gospel, or embody Christ to one another. And so this first principle of embodiment is one of those things that you can begin to implement perhaps in a weekly gathering, church or a staff meeting. Maybe it's a volunteer huddle, and asking the question week after week, how do we live life together because we live with the commonality of life in Jesus? Don Sonderquist said this, leaders are the standard setters as far as the values of an organization. And the reality is that if you are leading people, it is your responsibility if the staff culture is toxic, if the staff culture is hurting, if the staff culture is unintentional or misguided. And so we need to do the hard work to ask the questions, and we need to do the hard work to embody this value that we see in Christ and this value that we so want in the culture that we're in. And that starts with us. We need to, first of all, ask the question, am I healthy? And in which ways am I not embodying that which I want to see true in this church, in this staff, in this organization? The truth is, and whether you're a parent or whether you're a leader, the truth is your DNA is going to have an impact on those who come after you. Your DNA, your leadership DNA is going to have an impact on the culture and organization to which you are leading. An example of this, if you find yourself as a person who enjoys the office, you find yourself productive, you are studying, you are checking off items in your administrative checklist, the staff culture is going to be shaped by that. But if you're a person who, in your sense of value, sees that ministry can't take place best in the office, and so you find yourself out in the community, in the schools, and in the local areas of business, that too will have an impact on your staff culture. So evaluate yourself and ask, what are some of the things true of me? And what are some of the leadership DNA dynamics that I want to instill and pass on into this organization? We also need to ask this question. Do you really need everyone to look like you? I mean, perhaps you're the person who's up. I tend to get up early in the morning and love the early morning. I thrive there. I study most effectively in the morning. That's where I can focus. And so I know that for me, my best rhythm is to work early in the morning to middle of the afternoon. And somewhere around 3, 4 o'clock, man, I need to do some lower mental activities if I'm going to be effective. But do I need everyone on staff to be like that? Or can I allow for some diversity when it comes to other ways of doing things? So you embody these values, but I also want to argue that you need to clarify which are your values and which are values that you share with everyone else. So people will embody these values that you decide on. And the reality is that you will need to hire people who will embody them, and you'll need to let go of those who do not embody those. In order to do that, you need to clarify what you mean. So I want to move forward into the second section, which is to encode these values into the staff culture. And again, by encode, I almost want to take this DNA metaphor and transpose that into this idea of spreading that DNA into the lives of the culture and the lives of the people that you work with. With encoding, I want to encode theology. We've mentioned this. I want us to encode some of these truths into our staff, that we are all sinners and we need grace. There was one perfect person, and he died on a cross, and we follow him. And so those people that I work with do not need to be perfect. They can have weaknesses. They can have difficult seasons. They can have sin in their life. And we will work with them, and we will be gospel-centered. Now, we still want them to be above reproach. And so we will ask that question. If they go on sinning, do we need to give them the opportunity to be released of their leadership role and grow again in their faith and mature to a place of leadership? But we want to be gospel-centered. We want to recognize we are the body of Christ. We are not in this for any one leader. Each of us are interchangeable parts. We are all interim ministers, and we are the body of Christ. And so the senior leader or the senior leaders, the elders, we are all equal at the foot of the cross, and we are all servants. We are all stewards in this kingdom. And so no one of us can say to any other one in the body, we don't need you, you're not useful here. But the reality is that we also make some decisions when it comes to where one another serve. And so we find and we study and we learn about each other, and we learn the strengths and weaknesses of one another and where each person serves most effectively. We want to learn this, that we are all on mission for Christ, and we want to discover what that mission is We want to contextualize that into our specific location. We'll talk about that in a minute. We recognize that not only are we stewards, but we want to prioritize discipleship, and we want to pursue things like reconciliation and forgiveness. And when we have this encoded theology, this drives us towards certain behaviors and certain priorities. And it is this gospel-centeredness that we need to frame up before we come to what I will say would be encoding ultimately our mission or our values. I've put a metaphor or illustration for you on the slide here, and want to kind of articulate a few things about it. Many of these things are common, leadership, language, and leadership, tasks that you have probably gone through. But many of us have had mission statements that hung on a wall that really didn't make a big difference in the course of the staff culture or in the course of the church. I had a conversation one time with a good friend of mine. His name is Randy Garris. Some of you know him, and asked the question, like, is it even worth us having mission statements and purpose statements and vision statements? And the conversation, continued over a course of time. And in that course of time, Randy said this, and I thought it was incredibly wise. He said, the reality is churches will have a mission. Whether it is articulated clearly or not is another question. So again, coming back to the accidental, John Ortberg calls it a shadow mission. Churches will have a sense of mission. Now, it might be stated, but John Ortberg would say there might actually be a shadow mission. For instance, your mission might be make disciples of all people, love the neighborhood, love Christ. Various mission statements, some of them good. But the shadow mission is actually where you can trace behavior to, and where you can trace some of the actual culture. The shadow mission might be make everyone happy. Don't let the church doors close. Make budget every week. Make sure that we grow in attendance. And the mission becomes this subtle shadow mission that is actually behind everything that's going on. What I want to encourage you to do is evaluate your own mission and ask this question. How does it take this theology, this gospel mission that we have, and does it contextualize it into our current church setting? And does it make it something that is a rallying cry to which we all feel like we are called to do? Andy Stanley would say, is it portable? Do people recognize what that mission is and what they're called to do because of that? If I'm going to argue that mission is something that we are called to when it comes to the core of who we are, I'm also going to suggest to you that mission probably is not going to change very often. It's going to be verb driven, and it's going to stay fairly stable over the course of time. Here at Ozark Christian College, our mission has been true for 75 years. We've tweaked some words in it, but the reality is the mission has been to train men and women for Christian service, for ministry. And that has been true. That has been a rallying cry for this organization for over 75 years. And the church that I served in Monticello, Illinois, at that point in time, our mission statement was to grow people deeper in relationship with Jesus Christ and one another. And we kind of use that word grow to mean in the sense of discipleship, not necessarily in the means of the number of people, although we felt that discipleship included that as well. And so we want you to, go back and evaluate this mission statement as a team and ask, does it create a sense of a rallying cry of where people say, okay, this is what we were called to do, and this is why we exist as an organization. So the metaphor on the slide is that of a road. This is why we are on this road. This is our mission. This is where we're going. And ultimately that mission leads to a vision that says, here's where we're going next to complete that mission. And that might be a year out, 3 years out, or 5 years out, but it's somewhere in the future. And it's very adjective driven, very noun driven. It's something that you can see out in front of you and something that you can start to move toward. But those are two normal definitions that we talk about. Although I would argue, again, sometimes they're accidental and not very intentional. But what I want to draw your attention to are the two sides of the road in this particular illustration. On the right-hand side of the road, you see these core values that get mapped to core behaviors. These become like the rumble strip on the road. These are things that help you know that you're going out of bounds, that your behaviors are no longer in line with the mission and the vision. So these core values get mapped to key behaviors and policies and procedures and boundaries and even then unspoken rules. And what we want to do is move from unspoken rules up to core values, to move from accidental toward these things that are actualized. And so we'll come back to these in just a moment. But notice on the other side of the road is this strategic plan or this strategy. And this strategy is mapped out. It is the map of how we're going to get to the vision. And so this strategy includes things like our objectives. These become big objectives that we all share. How are we going to get there? Goals become more individual. How am I going to help us get there? And steps become, how am I knowing that I am actually getting there? And these metrics become these measurements that we have along the way that help us see our progress and be able to discover that we're moving toward our vision. What I want to focus on in our time together today is that right-hand side of the road, these core values that get mapped. Again, like the staff culture, I'm going to argue that these can be aspirational, actualized, and accidental. When I teach these to students, I actually take them to Chick-fil-A, and we go out to eat for breakfast, and we sit in the Joplin Chick-fil-A, and I ask them the question, what are the values of Chick-fil-A? Just look around you and observe. And they're able to come up with some pretty good answers: hospitality, cleanliness, even when it comes to quality of food. And they're able to look around and observe the values that Chick-fil-A has said, we want to have these as actualized values. Now that becomes helpful. But I then talk about, and I won't for the sake of being recorded today, but I talk about other restaurant chains, that you can go to in any given city. And I say, how many of them would have these same kind of value statements? We want to be clean. We want to value cleanliness. We value hospitality. We want to value affordability and quality. The reality is almost every other fast food restaurant chain would likely have some of those same value statements. The difference is in the fact that they have mapped those core values so intentionally to core behaviors or key behaviors that it becomes actualized. It becomes part of the landscape that when you walk into a Chick-fil-A, it's part of the experience that you see over and over and over again, and it has become franchised. So asking this question, I want to lead to this. How intentional have you been about mapping out what we will call core values? These are things that make up your heartbeat. Here is who we are. We will behave like this. In my family, one of my core values is, honestly, being on time. And so my kids know, hey, this is one of those things that dad is going to care about, and therefore we need to care about. And it comes with some core behaviors that are mapped out as well. We value cleanliness, and we, at times, most of the time, value health. And so there's certain behaviors that we have when it comes to eating food and buying groceries. Those are mapped out to these key behaviors. Have you done this as a staff? Taken core values and said, okay, so what do these look like? And what does this look like in our daily behaviors and how we interact with one another? On the staff that I work with here, we have mapped out 7. It really started with 5, but we have mapped out these 7 core value statements. And in the course of our meetings, our weekly meetings and our quarterly strategic meetings, we go back over these values and we ask the question, so what does this look like this week? Or what does this look like in this event or this element or this letter? And even this last week, I asked the question, what does this value look like in this particular meeting and how we have this meeting? Let me show you kind of what I mean by this. The first one, cohesive chemistry. You can see behaviors mapped out in the sense that we want to be a staff that gets along, that enjoys working together. But when we disagree, we commit to one another that we will get together and we will work out the problem. And we will do that sooner rather than later. In fact, we hold each other accountable to that. And even as a church staff, this kind of value came out in the sense of a staff covenant, that when we have conflict, we will not email one another, that we will not text one another, we will not gossip, we will get together. And if we don't get together, then our senior leader, the supervisor over us, will get us together. And they will confront the situation. We will commit to being a cohesive staff and have cohesiveness as our chemistry. Collective responsibility says this: if something fails, then we all fail, and we all need to be able to identify something, for instance, a typo in the bulletin, and call attention to it and stop the press or stop the assembly line. And collectively, we own the values that we have. Complex clarity, one of our illustrations for that is like Google. Google, their homepage is just Google and the entry bar, and you have the clarity of knowing how to use Google. But behind that bar is a vast amount of complexity. Their staff has dealt with the complexity so that you as the guest or as their user can use and appreciate the clarity that is there. So, this takes place in our event registrations here on campus and various other elements of our staff. We want to do the hard work so that those who are our constituents or those who are our guests find a sense of clarity. Connected content would be one that I mentioned in our meeting the other day. I just asked the question, is this meeting doing what it needs to do? And is it connecting with you? Is the content doing what it needs to do? So what we do with these values is that every week we actually in our huddle, we mention one and then I illustrate. Here's how I saw this value played out in a core behavior this last week. Here's how I've seen you live this out. Here's how I failed at living this out. And here is what I think we can do better to live this out in the future. You're going to need to come up with your own value statements. You're going to need to encode them, to clarify them. And they're going to look different for you. If you are a church or an organization, if you're a small church or a medium-sized church or a large church, you're going to look different depending on the part of the country, the part of the world that you are in. Obviously, because we are followers of Christ, they are going to have some parallels. But as a staff, you need to make sure that they become part of your language. You need to then map them to core behaviors. Those core behaviors may come in the form of policies. And so ask the question of policies. Do your policies match up with your values? What about like office hours? What about unspoken policies or unspoken rules? Do those match up with, or do those actually add to the toxicity of your staff culture? And begin to be intentional about defining these things and then celebrate them and evaluate them over the course of time. Celebrate the person who lives out one of your values, and yet evaluate one another when you don't. Andy Stanley said this one time, and I found it very applicable. He said, stories and questions are honestly the best way to enforce, to reinforce organizational values and behaviors. Here's what I mean by this. As a parent, if you value clean rooms, one of the things you're going to say to your children are, have you cleaned your room yet? And you don't need to say, hey, we as a family, we value clean rooms and things put in their proper place. No, the question gives way to that. If you ask that question often enough, the child is going to know we value clean rooms in this family. Same kind of thing with my kids and my family. Hey, are you ready yet? Is the question I ask all of the time. Well, accidental or intentional, on my part it's intentional, I'm communicating to them we value timeliness. We value being on time. So questions. Stories become another way to reinforce this. And in my time as a senior minister, I used illustrations of people who embodied our core values and said, man, have you seen Dick Daniel and the way that he serves the church? Have you seen this family and the way that they serve this elderly person in their neighborhood? And we tell those kinds of stories to celebrate and reinforce those behaviors. As a football coach, I remember coaching a kindergarten football team, and one of the young running backs would always run in the wrong direction. Of course, he's running away from the conflict, away from the difficulty, and he'd run the wrong way, but everyone in the crowd would be like, no, 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 go the other way. But as soon as he'd turn around, everyone began to cheer, and he could hear them applaud. Well, as soon his wiring, his brain picked up on, oh, if I run this direction, everyone is applauding, versus if I run this direction, everyone is shouting at me. And you know what happened. Eventually, his habits and his behaviors were shaped by those who were cheering him on. You as a leader can do the same kind of thing. And the stories you tell and the cadence that you have of reinforcing these things and focusing on them and clarifying them for your team. So here's what we know. When these values become habits and they also become insider language, then we know that we started to cultivate the culture. That just takes a lot of time. So I just want to encourage you, work on the process of clarifying and mapping those to key behaviors, but then continually keep these in front of your people, in front of your staff. One of the values we had in our church staff is we valued discipleship. We valued growing people. Our mission was to grow people into relationship with Jesus Christ and one another. And so we actually had a whiteboard that we brought into the beginning of every single staff meeting, every single eldership meeting toward the end of my time in ministry. And this whiteboard was showing people in our church who had made decisions and discipleship steps on their journey of growth. And it also it indicated where they still had room to grow or where we could help cultivate growth in them. Well, even by bringing that board, that whiteboard as a tangible artifact into those meetings, it communicated something. We are a church that values the discipleship of individual people, and we will focus on this when it comes to our rhythm and when it comes to our leadership dynamics. Well, my hope is for you is that you can come to some clarified core values and a clarified mission and vision, and even your strategy, that you can bring objectives, and those things become the focus at the beginning of some of your meetings and some of your time together, and that will begin to shape some of those behaviors that you have. Let me talk about this third one, evaluate, before we take questions at the end. There were other words that I wanted to put here. One of them was enforce, which sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? But at the same time, these are boundary markers. And so if your value statements show this is what it looks like to belong here or to stay here, and over again, you go over that boundary, then we will need to enforce that boundary. And we will need to let you know that your behavior either needs to change, or we are going to need to let you go as a staff person. So enforce could be the word we'd use. Second word we could use would be encourage. This would be the opportunity we have to say, okay, you're doing a great job, and to encourage them forward to continue to embody those values. But I'm going to use the word evaluate. And I love what Henry Cloud says. He says, in the end, at the end of the day, as a leader, you're going to get the combination of two things: what you create and what you allow. Boy, I'll just be honest, sometimes that statement terrifies me. It is no small thing, no small burden to be responsible, not only for the mission, the strategy, the effectiveness of a church or of a team, but it's no small thing to be responsible for the culture and, more importantly, the individual lives of those whom you lead. So as a leader, it is important for us to recognize that what we create and what we allow is our responsibility. We own that, and we need to take ownership of it and be more intentional. So evaluate ourselves first and foremost as leaders. We're accountable. Stewards are accountable for our own integrity, for being above reproach, for our hard work, our faithfulness, our fruitfulness, for equipping and maturing. We're accountable for what we've been called to do, and we need to instill what it's a book, 4 Disciplines of Execution, calls the cadence of accountability. It's just rhythm of accountability. And so we need to evaluate and instill evaluation in this cadence that we have as a staff. That might be in regular debriefs after an event, after Sunday. I would sit down with our worship minister on Monday morning, Monday afternoon, and say, okay, how did that go? How could that have been better? There was a cadence of accountability there to our core value, a core value of excellence, a core value of discipleship, a core value of worship. We would have weekly huddles as a staff, and we would keep these values in front of one another, these objectives in our direction in front of one another. Quarterly strategic meetings would be more intentional about asking, okay, so how are we doing and what are these values, but also where are we going and how are we going to get there? Yearly evaluations would be an honest sit down. I don't know that I would want to surprise anyone, but an honest sit down to say, okay, how have you lived out the values of this organization, the values of this church? How have you accomplished the strategic plan, the objectives, the goals, the steps, the metrics that you have and we have collectively put together for you as a part of your clarified job? How have you, in that sense, moved us toward our mission and toward our vision? And so we want to evaluate these. And I would argue that you should probably be doing this in real time as well as a yearly process. And then sometimes there needs to be a situational evaluation, a situational response where we say, that's not how we handle that. And let's evaluate and let's refocus. So that brings me to this question. So how long do you let it go before you confront, before confrontation? I actually have kind of a personal table. That sounds very nerdy perhaps, but I have kind of a personal value statement that I have as a leader that says, here's how long I'm willing to let certain behaviors go before I'm going to confront them the first time. And then even before I'm going to confront them to the point of needing to move them toward dismissal. And so it kind of moves along the spectrum of, okay, so how are you doing? I'm going to check in with you, and I'm going to pay attention to your needs and how things are going, and move it toward okay, so we've agreed that this is not how we are going to behave, but there is a dynamic that's going on here, and we're going to move through it. In fact, we must move through it to ultimately a place where we say, we can't let this continue. And if this continues, then you can't continue here. And so you need to ask that question: how long will you let certain behaviors go? For me, compromises in character that are rebellious, that are not in any sense remorseful. Some of those things I won't let go beyond even a moment. But there's other things, sickness, or someone who is struggling in a course of life, that will let certain behaviors take place that aren't the norm because of a situation that's going on in life. And so I would encourage you to evaluate those kinds of questions when you come to it. How long will we let this go? And then confront those things. By the way, like the New Testament, we see that it's okay to confront, and it's even okay to part ways. Paul and Barnabas part ways. And Scott McKnight, in his book that he edits, one of his students argues that this was a difference for Paul and Barnabas of mission, of their sense of calling, is that Barnabas perhaps more pastorally focused on the encouragement of an individual, but Paul on planting and establishing churches. And that divergence of their mission inside of the mission of Christ, that contextualized, personalized mission, caused them to need to part ways. And yet the gospel was furthered. And yet at the end of his life, Paul is able to say, like, go get John Mark. He's useful to me. And so we see that even in the New Testament, some of these things take place. Sometimes situationally, we need to debrief failure. And I've listed for you 10 questions that we ask when something fails. And we need to ask, okay, why did this fail? And come through that process. If we value something like excellence, or if we value intentionality. And so we want to ask these kinds of core questions and be very intentional in that process. So, in the course of this time, I want you to contextualize this to your own leadership and ask these questions. How am I embodying the culture that I want to see lived out? And how am I hiring, and how am I articulating these things in such a way that people have a clarified vision for what kind of people we need to be to work together in this staff? The second thing, encoding. Then go ahead and encode them, clarify them, state them, write them down, put them in writing, and then put them in front of your people, your staff, over and over again. Encode them, make it a part of your language, make it a part of your rhythm, map it to behaviors, make sure that it's a part of the daily activities that you have. If you value discipleship, so how are you then programming your church to value discipleship? Map those core behaviors out. And then ultimately make sure that you go through the continual process of evaluating those behaviors as well. Well, that's the kind of the, what we would do is kind of an introduction of the process for putting values in place to continue down this journey of establishing staff culture, a healthy staff culture. But I want to kind of close by saying this is a never-ending task for us as leaders. We are always adapting and seeing new realities and new dynamics come into play. And so we are always failing. And we always need to have an eye on this reality, that it is part of our responsibility to shepherd, to disciple those in our care, whether they be staff, volunteer, or those in our church. And that this will be ongoing, and we will always have to adapt and always have to continue to push these things forward. So I just want to open up for a few minutes, and if I don't see any questions come open, we'll close out our time. But if any of you have questions you'd like to ask, go ahead and post those in the Q&A section, and I'll try to answer those for you. Okay, friends, I'm not seeing any questions come up, which is fine. I will encourage you, if you want to continue this conversation and perhaps go into depth, as well as to go into focus to your particular context, I would invite you to communicate with me in one of two ways. One of those would be through my email address, dalrymple.jim@occ.edu. The second one would simply be by reaching out to me on social media, and we can try to set up an opportunity to have a phone call or a conversation through that vehicle, and hopefully in this process, open up some dialogue between you, myself, and maybe some others who are struggling through or working through this process. I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for your ministry. I'm thankful for the struggle that you have to bring people together, to move them forward in Christ likeness, to accomplish what he's called us to do. I pray you have a great day. God bless.